Hi everybody, Jason here. Today we have another episode of The Sacred Word. Now for those of you who are new to the channel, The Sacred Word is a video series where I unpack and decode some of the greatest texts in the world. And today we have another great text, the Yoga Vashishta. Now, not many people know the Yoga Vashishta. It's one of the lesser known texts coming out of India. But for those who have discovered it, it is a very cherished text because it goes very deep into a lot of non-dual philosophy. Now, when a lot of people think about non-dualism, a lot of people think about the Mandukya Upanishad, and we think about the Viveka Chudamani, and these sorts of texts. But we don't really think about the Yoga Vashishta. But if you've been fortunate to come across the Yoga Vashishta, then you know how important this text is. Now, this text is radically non-dualist. And what I mean by that is it works off of the understanding that everything is consciousness. So from the get-go, we have a fundamental non-dualist understanding of the world with the Yoga Vashishta. So when you come to the Yoga Vashishta, you have to be very cautious because this text can throw your worldview upside down, especially if you have never come across the idea that everything is consciousness or there is only mind only in the world. And there's no external and internal and so forth. So this can be very dangerous territory for those who are new, but it can be very refreshing for those who are very familiar with non-dualist philosophy. But I implore all of you to dive into the Yoga Vashishta. Now first, who is the author of the Yoga Vashishta? Now the author is Valmiki. Now Valmiki is believed to be also the author of the Ramayana epic, one of the classics of Hinduism. And in this story, in the form of an imaginary dialogue in the Yoga Vashishta with the ancient hero Ramachandra and the sage Vashishta, Valmiki presents an abundance of ideas and stories and experiences revealing the fundamental nature of the universe. This is the beauty of this text. Now today I want to read to you chapter 53 of the 6th book of the Yoga Vashishta. Now what's interesting is chapter 53 to 58 are known as the Brahma Gita, which is modeled on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, a lot of people don't know what the Brahma Gita is. Now, that's what these chapters are. Chapter 53 to 58 is the Brahma Gita. But as I said, it's modeled on the Bhagavad Gita. But the context may be the same. But what's really good about the Yoga Vashishta, as opposed to the Bhagavad Gita, is it goes very deep into non-dualist philosophy. And so let's now have a look at chapter 53. That which is the universal being in the multitude of things, from the creator God Brahma down to a blade of grass, know that to be the unborn self. The creator God Brahma is a slightly vibrating form of the absolute Brahman, which emerges because of delusion by a process that establishes the egoity, aham, etc., as well as the world, jagat, etc. Since the self is of the form of this entire world, what can it destroy? And what can it destroy here? How can one, O Arjuna, be defiled by the misery of the world, by good or evil? Abiding as a witness, the self is like a mirror toward its reflections. He who sees that it is indestructible among destructible things, he truly sees. I explain that I am this world, and yet also not this world. Thus I am the self. Know me to be the self of everything, O Pandava. All these processes of creation and dissolution occur in the self. The egoity, aham, abiding in the finite consciousness, chitta, is like the water moving in the ocean. Like the solidity of stones, or the hardness of earth's trees, or the liquidity of waves, so is the selfhood, atman, of things. He who sees the self abiding in all beings, and all beings in the self, and who sees that the self is not an egoic agent, he truly sees. Just as the water of waves of different shapes is always the same, so, O Arjuna, is the self in a desert caravan, etc., or in the beings of the golden Himalayas. Just as a multitude of different waves roll in the same ocean, similarly, the beings in the golden Himalayas or in the caravans, etc., have their substance in the Supreme Self. The totality of things and beings, including the great creator god Brahma, O Bharata, Know everything as one. There is not even the least separateness. First of all, in this quote, it says the creator God, Brahma, but we could also say the creative principle, right? So we have Brahma, which is the creative principle, Vishnu, which is the sustainer or the preserving principle, and then we have Shiva, the destructive principle or the process of deconstruction or decay. And so you have to get some of the terminology right. And also when they mention the self with a capital S, we are talking about the Atman, so the undifferentiated consciousness beyond the personality. So a lot of people, when they think about self, they think about themselves as a person, like I'm Jason, right? Like this is myself. But for whatever reason, when Sanskrit was translated into English, they tended to use this capital S self to kind of symbolize this one undifferentiated consciousness. So I prefer to say undifferentiated consciousness as the self, but I just wanted to make sure that you don't misunderstand that. And also remember, Brahma, the creative principle, is different to the absolute Brahman, which is the ultimate reality of the world. Brahman is the ultimate reality. Now, Atman is identical with Brahman. It is Brahman actually, but we have to find that within ourselves. And then we understand that everything is consciousness and everything is one. The one undifferentiated Brahman. So in this passage of the Yoga Vasishtha, you see that there's an emphasis on that there's consciousness only. So we're using Brahman here as consciousness, right, in the text. And a lot of people will say that this idea of consciousness only actually is encapsulated in this idea of the absolute Brahman. So in this text, the phenomenal world is only a reflection of the universal mind, which is Brahma, according to sage Vasishtha. So this universal or cosmic mind of Brahma, the creative principle, is the generator of all ideas under whose spell we have fallen if we don't recognize the undifferentiated self, the Atman, at the core of our being and also at the core of other people's beings. When we think about this universal or cosmic mind of Brahma as the generator of all ideas and so forth until we realize the self, we should actually relate it to a painter. Because just as a painter is filled with numerous images of a great variety of objects, so too pure consciousness is suffused with images of multiple forms of nature. So our consciousness is suffused with multiple forms of nature. So this idea that there's no external and internal, what we see is all one consciousness. Even me looking at you now and you looking at me, it's all part of the one consciousness. There's actually no separation. We are experiencing each other through consciousness as consciousness, but there's no separation. So the world we experience is not real nor unreal because it is situated in consciousness itself, but appears to be external to the unenlightened mind. So what we see, according to Sage Vasishtha and the Yoga Vasishtha, is that what we experience is within consciousness itself. It's neither external or internal, neither real or unreal, but it's all situated in the one consciousness. So what we are experiencing is part of ourselves. It's not just an extension of ourselves, it is ourselves, everything that we experience. So this idea of experiencing objects is just conjured up by the mind, right? The mind is the problem according to the Yoga Vasishtha. And this is similar to dreams, right? Because in dreams, we dream this whole reality and there are these objects of perception, but they don't really exist. Now we take that understanding and we put that onto reality itself in our waking state, according to the Yoga Vasishtha. So experiencing objects is simply an idea, just like the way we experience objects in our dreams, right? It's simply an idea according to this text. So what they explain in this passage that I read to you is we must transcend the mind to understand and see reality from that place. We must come back to the understanding that there is only consciousness, but we cannot experience that or we cannot abide as that if our ego is in the way. And our ego here is the mind, right? It's that persona that we have built in our mind due to the misidentification with the external world, because we think that the external world is something separate from us, and then we construct a personality and we construct a belief system and so forth and so on, which doesn't allow us to see that everything is only consciousness. So we need to break down this wrong conceptualization that we have within our mind. And that's what the Yoga Vasishtha is all about. It's about breaking that down. So the main takeaway from this passage is that Krishna is explaining to Arjuna that once you understand, or once you abide as the self, as the Atman, when you come back into your true nature, then what happens is that you start to see the self in others. No matter what circus they're putting on the outside or who they believe they are, you can perceive that self, the Atman, in all things. And that's what really dissolves this illusion of external and internal, and this idea that there is a world out there separate from the world inside yourself. So there's kind of this marinating and merging of both worlds when you realize the Atman. This is what Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna. And this is one of the hallmarks of the whole Yoga Vasishtha text, is that the continual dissolution of your ego, of the so-called mind that we think we are, then you come into contact with this only consciousness state. And you see the world as it truly is, which is the absolute Brahman. That's the point of the Yoga Vasishtha and of a lot of the non-dualist texts. Now, like I said to you earlier, that this is one of the more radical non-dualist texts, but I highly recommend going out and getting yourself a copy of the Yoga Vasishtha, because especially if you're interested in non-duality, this is one of the go-to texts. And in some sense can be better than a lot of the other famous Vedanta texts. But this Yoga Vasishtha is a real classic. And if you want to understand the true nature of your being, no matter whether you think that everything is one and there's no external or internal, but if you want to understand the true nature of your being, then read this text. And then after reading this text and understanding it truthfully, then you can decide whether there is an external and whether there is an internal, or whether there is one absolute Brahman. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.